Well, good afternoon. Let me welcome everyone that's viewing this, the first edition of the DSI Security Services Security Evolution Podcast. We're operating under a little different conditions than we had predicted just a few months ago. So we're changing things up a bit and wanted to go ahead and launch this first episode with two of the most influential leaders that I know in the security industry to talk about what we're going through as it relates to the coronavirus situation. It certainly impacted our world and our country, but also impacted security services in a very specific way. So privilege for me to have a couple of great friends on the first episode here. Mark Folmer, who is the Vice President of Security Industry at Track Tik, and also Don Aviv, who is the President of Interfor. So I want to introduce these guys. We're going to have a great discussion about coronavirus here in a minute, but wanted to start off by just having these guys tell a little bit about themselves and what they do. So Mark, why don't you start off for us?
I knew I was going to get to go first. Thank you, Eddie. Really happy to be here, and happy to be joined by both of you in the basement instead of in the office. And essentially, nearly 25 year security industry veteran, for lack of a better word. From the security service side, also spent some time on the corporate security team with a large telecommunication company, and then the last over 4 years with Track Tik, a security workforce management software based out of Montreal, but serving clients essentially around the world.
All right, great. Thanks, Mark. Don.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. It's always great to join you guys. Irrespective of the fact that we're spread around the country at this moment. As the intro was, Don Aviv. I am a longtime member of ASIS, along with my brethren on this podcast, and happy to be so. I run Interfor International, which is a 40-year-old corporate intelligence and security consulting firm. Right now, I'm sitting in New York City, in the heart of Manhattan, which is a literal ghost town. And I'm one of the few people in Midtown that has the luxury of being, or the burden of being considered an essential service, like most of our security professionals are around the country. And therefore, I am duty bound to be in the office and at my desk. So happy to be here.
Yeah, and Don, as you mentioned, you're in New York City, and one of the great things about having you two guys on is you don't just represent different sides of the industry, but different geographic perspectives. So Mark in Canada and you in New York. And Mark, back to you. How are things going in Canada? How has the response been there locally?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. Response has been drastic. I think I've been working from home now since March 13th. We're a software company, as you know, and flipping that switch for us was quote unquote relatively easy, I guess. Our clients, our security service providers, of course, working from home is not an option, right? I mean, Don, case in point, providing intel and insight and knowledge right from his office. Canada as a whole, I'm based in Montreal, which is kind of on the eastern side. Unfortunately, Quebec, the province that I'm in, has the distinction of having the highest numbers in Canada right now, and seems to be because of where our spring break was and a fair bit of travel in that time, and it was right in the beginning of March, and then other provinces was going to be much later. So a lot of people were traveling during that time. Social distancing here, like everywhere else, explained in terms that people will understand. Saw the city of Toronto had posted a poster about keeping at least a hockey stick apart from the person next to you. So I thought that was quite funny. But stimulus packages for businesses, for employees, people that are out of work, and then generally security being labeled as an essential service, to what Don mentioned before. So security service providers continue to deliver service. Generally, states of emergency in most cities, towns, provinces, and to different degrees, of course. Of late, I was reading a report yesterday. Local police here have given out hundreds of fines for people not respecting the ask to be socially distant. So, yeah, that's a quick recap there.
Yeah, and being from Alabama, you can explain to me later what a hockey stick is. Show me a picture one of these days. And Don, you mentioned being in New York. Obviously, we see on the media that's a real hot spot and a lot of challenges there. So what have you seen locally?
Well, first of all, we have the unfortunate designation of once again being called ground zero for a national or international tragedy. Our death count is the highest in the nation and is on track to beat Italy as projected, which is unfortunate. We are seeing a very mixed response here. First of all, we have the country's largest police force of 38,000 police officers. Last count, I'm looking at the stats now, we had something like 5,000 to 6,000 officers call in sick alone. Many of them are unfortunately impacted, whether at home via a spouse or a family member or themselves. So when you look at the statistics, that number is rising every day. We have federal agents, we have the military on the ground here. There are a number of field hospitals that have been set up in public parks and convention centers. It literally is out of a Netflix original movie or some sort of movie. I've never seen anything like this, even after 9/11, when we had a fully militarized city. Right now, the avenues and the streets are empty. But we're seeing an increase, and it's not really going reported for a number of reasons, but crime is up. Not just cybercrime, but physical crime is up because there's a lot of opportunity here at this point. Stores are boarded up, and while some departments and organizations and stores and retail organizations are increasing security, many of them are decreasing just because it's harder to man a post, or transit is becoming very difficult. So what we're seeing is stores are just boarding themselves up or just locking down. And what you're having is the opportunistic crime of the smash and grabs and the breaking and entering. And to add to that, law enforcement is not making the arrests. They're not engaging with a typical transient or suspicious individual that they used to, because of the nature of not wanting to get into that close proximity of having to put handcuffs on an individual or even engage with an individual. So we're seeing the mixed result of increased opportunity for criminal behavior, at the same time a reluctance of law enforcement to engage with individuals that they normally would have stopped and had a conversation with. So I see this as a problem, and we're going to see, I think, an increase in crime exponentially in the coming days. It's already ticking up, but at the same time, reporting is going down. So, who's to say what the end result is going to be? As far as what's happening in New York, it's truly debilitating. You're having essential services mandated to work, but we're having, we don't have access to the PPE. We don't have access to transit. I can't take the subway or trains right now myself. I've been driving just because that's the only thing available to me. And it's difficult. And you're seeing the real resistancy of just the social fabric holding together. But I'm curious to see what happens in the coming days.
Over time.
Yeah, and you raise a great point. I think it is certainly a mixed bag right now. I was on a call just before we jumped on this podcast, and I was being asked, and I get this question quite a bit, as I'm sure you guys do. Where do you stand? Is business going up? Is it going down? How are you being impacted? It really is a mixed bag. We're seeing that, throughout the landscape from coast to coast, where we're having issues just like every other business is having. Officers being quarantined, some testing positive, issues around PPE. And the analogy that I've been making, which is not exactly apples to apples here, but it's like after a natural disaster, we're experiencing the same thing that our customers and the rest of the world's experiencing, except we are in that essential worker category. So we're having to really make sure we can get through that somehow and continue to provide those services, while at the same time dealing with a workforce that has to remain safe themselves, the issues with PPE, and making sure we can meet the customer's demands. And you put it very well, Don, about the criminal issues are certainly going to increase. And then you have that with law enforcement being diminished and other issues. But Mark, what are you seeing as far as your conversations with people in the industry? How are they trying to really get through some of these toughest challenges?
Yeah, great points, Eddie, and Don too, of course. But I think it really, from what I've seen, so surveying, whether it's Security Service Council members, whether it's other security service providers, we work with over 600 of them globally, and it really depends on the sectors that they're in. You know, the type of work that they're doing, the type of work that they're delivering, the geography that they're in too. Of course, in terms of timing, you know, kind of what part of the pandemic that they're in, and if it's still sort of early days or you know, the kind of right in the middle of it. And then the ability to pivot is another thing that I've kind of heard a lot about. You know, folks that were maybe in the or heavily into the event and or major event space, hospitality sectors, those kind of things, able to pivot into much more, you know, kind of frontline essential retail, getting into you know, kind of outside or external kind of temperature checks and so on. It's many of them dealing with, you know, what Don described, you know, the COVID crimes, the break-in enters, the fraud schemes that are out there and going on, and really having to adjust to how they're offering service. Eddie, you touched on it, you know, getting a guard to a site is tougher and tougher and tougher. You know, if you can't take public transit, if you can't easily get in and get out, and, you know, what if, God forbid, somebody falls sick and then, you know, has to self-quarantine. At the same time, you know, corporate security folks, you know, they're switching gears, right? Their assets remain the same, but how they are and the condition of those assets is probably changing, and they go from a lot of sort of prevention and planning to now actually responding, you know, and kind of getting into those incidents and issues. And I mean, I'm impressed. Business continuity professionals, emergency management folks, you know, really rolling up their sleeves and executing those different plans. And how the service providers are deploying their security teams to respond to the different issues, I think, is one that we're going to see not only change now during the pandemic, but I think over time and sort of as we get through it, we're going to see that we're going to see those service offerings probably change as well. Quick comment about industry associations. You know, as both you've mentioned, we're part of ASIS International, but it's been refreshing to see the different associations come together and share resources, whether it's SMB resources, you know, on kind of how those companies can get help, but all the way through to, you know, actual, you know, COVID-19 pages and different resources that people can pull up. As a software company, you know what, our mission's to build software, right? So we're looking at current situations, current market, current challenges, and we're saying, well, how can we help, you know, security businesses run smarter, run differently, and then really affect that kind of the value equation of security to kind of say, okay, we're being recognized now as an essential service and we're able to kind of deliver, but what about down the road, right? How can security really position itself more so now to kind of go forward and be either more efficient, provide better insight, or provide added value?
Yeah, and you mentioned the association with ASIS International, which we're all involved in, and we're currently working on a project to really recognize the security officer. And I think one of the silver linings, if there is one that comes out of this, is really recognizing how valuable those frontline security officers really are. They're being asked to do things they could not have imagined they would be doing just a few months ago or even a few weeks ago. So I think moving forward, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute and get you guys' thoughts on how this is going to change security services moving forward. But Don, one of the issues we've heard a lot about is people working from home. We've gone through that ourselves, and it's not just as easy as saying, hey, grab a laptop, go home and keep working. You have all kind of issues related to cybersecurity, and I've actually talked to some people just this week about some issues that a lot of people don't even think about when it comes to trade secrets, intellectual property, et cetera. So what are you hearing, and what are your thoughts on some of those vulnerabilities that are going to be popping up based on remote work?
Well, I mean, cybercrime is up. It's up astronomically. I mean, we're seeing stats anywhere from 75 to 90% as far as the vectors of attack against medium-sized businesses, small businesses, large businesses. We've seen it all, and it's actually pretty scary. And we're talking about everything from, you know, the scams, the frauds that normally hit companies are now being targeted at individuals at home. So you may have a world-class data protection system or organization within your company, or, you know, great great IT security protocols and procedures. But when you're working from home and you're working off your home laptop or your old PC, all that goes out the window. And there are a lot of vulnerabilities that you may not have envisioned, and neither did your company, because for most of us, this happened very quickly. We didn't have the opportunity to start issuing technology and equipment and sending people home. A lot of companies just had to, rush their people home and rely on Zoom and a lot of these networking systems that we now know are extremely vulnerable. I mean, this system we're using right now is considered highly vulnerable, and the FBI has issued warnings not to use it. Well, that's we're doing it right now, and so are many companies, and that's how they're surviving. So we're seeing fraud go through the roof, attacks, and everything from, the checks that are supposed to come from the government to help people out. There's a lot of scams hitting. And quite frankly, federal agents are working from home. A lot of the DOJ, FBI, Secret Service, they're working from home too. So what you're seeing is a tremendous increase in attack vectors. At the same time, a de-escalation in the number of resources we had as a society to fight and protect against this. So I will say there's one positive is I've never seen in all my years in the industry this kind of, and as Mark mentioned before, this coming together of security professionals across organizations and different trade groups. And I've seen a tremendous amount of cross-pollination and coordination, and it really makes me feel good. I mean, I'm seeing Y2K handbooks being brushed off and brought into service, which, I thought I would never see those books again in my lifetime, but that's how far back we're going. But at the same time, the bad guys are coming up with new and greater attacks, and they're being successful. I mean, right now, the big banks are warning against attacks against individuals, hacks and fraud schemes that are successful, and we don't have the resources to really protect against it. So it's beholden upon us as security professionals to let our teams know, and the companies we work for, to be cognizant and to be very hyper aware and vigilant as to what's going on. And it was what in the old days, not so long ago, maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago, you can walk down to IT and say, hey, I got this email, or something's happening that's weird on my device. Now we don't have that luxury. We have to hopefully reach someone who's working from home and may not be available because their kids are running around crazy in the house. So this is a new normal. I feel that we're going to be really learning a lot about how business runs, the security business, and the clients that we all support going forward. So these are interesting times, and I hope someone is really taking note of all that's transpiring.
Yeah, and one of the things we've talked a lot about internally is just how different business continuity planning is going to be in the future. I know just our personal planning has already taken on many different shapes and forms, just planning for the future. We've got to get out of this first. And I want to ask you guys the magic question I get asked, and I'm sure you do every day: when's this going to be over? We have to define over first, but I think business continuity planning is going to look a lot different in the future. We're all learning a lot. And when it comes to associations, we mentioned ASIS International being one of the main associations that we're all active in, but all associations have done a great job that I've seen in our space, and it really highlights the value of being a part of those associations. I've talked to a lot of colleagues in the security industry just in the past few days, and I'll share information, and they'll ask me the source, and I'll tell them one of the associations, and they will talk about how they can access that because they're not part of that association. They're not plugged in. So that's been invaluable. Well, let me ask one of the biggest questions here, and we'll sort of try to predict as much as we can to see what the future holds. But if you could sort of just explain, how do you think this is going to change security services moving forward? What would you say?
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I think you're going to see an increase in remote security. And I know that concept is very amorphous and it's very hard to pin down, but I would say we're seeing some good come from this as far as protection of resources and IP and facilities. But I think you're going to see a shift to more remote digital surveillance type security than your typical officer at a post, because this is the opportunity, unfortunately, for many of these union jobs here in the tri-state area of New York and New Jersey and Connecticut to use this opportunity to say, hey, listen, we can provide the same level of protection, by putting, a couple guys behind a bank of cameras as opposed to, boots on the ground. So I think that's there'll be a shift in the type of protection you'll see or services offered, but we'll have to be, flexible and see what we can offer our clients. But unfortunately, many of our clients may not be coming back from this, and I think we're seeing that, especially on the retail side. In the Northeast, a lot of retail organizations that we would have, traditionally protected and supported will not be coming back from this. So what the industry looks like will be dependent upon what our client base looks like. But I'm hopeful, and I think to take a stab at it, I think New York City will begin to come back, I think, in 2 weeks' time. I think that you'll start seeing an increase in the volume of, or who's designated an essential service. And I think you'll see a lot of those come, back in slowly. But I caution one thing, and, we speak to medical professionals, and we're in on the OEM and a lot of the organizations that are dedicated to managing this crisis here in the Northeast. And we're saying that this is going to happen in waves. The biggest concern will be today, we may have a dip in the number of infections and the death rate, but since everything takes kind of a 2-week, 14 to 20 day cycle, if we let out too quickly and everyone goes back to work too quickly, then we can have a new peak in infections. And that's what's happening in Europe and even in Asia right now. Some of our offices in Asia are coming back online, and some of our clients are, but at the same time, we're seeing new infections in Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, et cetera. And so that's a concern. And here in this, densely populated area of New York City, the concern is if everyone goes back to work too soon, we'll have an issue again in the middle of summer and possibly the end of the summer, because the previous belief of temperature not being being an indicator of, if when it's too hot, the infection rate goes down is not proving realistic, because we're seeing a spike in Latin America and in Africa as well. So I don't know when that date will be for the rest of the country, but it's kind of a wave that's starting on the East Coast and going west. So hopefully, this will peter out by the end of the summer for all of us. But it's dependent upon testing, and it's dependent upon what we kind of have as far as some sort of antibody defense protocol by the health professionals.
Yeah. Well, let's hope it's sooner rather than later. So, Mark, how is this going to change our industry moving forward?
Good, great question and good insight, Don. One thing for sure, cold is not an indicator in terms of when this can be curbed, because weather's been up and down here of late, and we still see our numbers going up. So hopefully, it's unfortunate that heat isn't. You know what, Eddie, I think to answer the question, there were issues in the industry before, right? Especially if we think about the frontline security industry and sort of the boots on the ground that Don referred to. Lots of turnover. It was really tough to hire, retain, engage security officers. I think forward-looking end users or security managers were looking at service offering from a company, and what does that look like? And then again, forward-looking security service providers were saying, like, we're not just going to provide manpower. We'll provide manpower with some technology, with some shared services, and so on. So really get a mix across that. And the other thing or the other service delivery method, I think that's going to continue going up is all the shared service or the mobile service, something that was on an uptick in the last year or so, but anything to do with alarm response and patrol work, I think as boroughs, neighborhoods, municipalities, and so on put in false alarm fines and so on, that was kind of slowly sort of increasing that. I think that something like this, where it's tougher to get human resources to move around is going to definitely increase. And then to Don's point, using less number of officers, and then choosing how they get deployed and what sort of work that they do. So whether it's sitting behind a bank of monitors, but just kind of better human resource or more efficient human resource deployment. The human or the security officer for the judgment, and then the machine for that kind of regular surveillance and the day-to-day. I mean, I've read a lot and seen some comments in and around pushing minimum pay rates up. Is that going to stick around? Is that just going to be a short-term thing? I'd love to hear, you guys' take on that. And then essential services, what's the longevity? What's the longevity behind that? Right now, there's definitely a sentiment of, frontline security. Let's appreciate them. Let's thank them. Let's, be recognizant of them, sort of going to work day to day and supporting that things continue. Hopefully that'll stick around afterwards. And that's, I think, on us to kind of make sure that recognition continues to happen from the public, and then also from the greater security community too. In terms of timeline, I think we're months or month maybe minimum kind of for local sort of easing up. I've heard a lot of major events up here have been canceled. I've heard comments in and around, schools gradually going back, maybe half classes in the morning, half classes in the afternoon, to kind of have a little bit more space between students. Some questions or some discussions in and around, the less traditional rush hour that we're, kind of accustomed to, people being in the office from 9 to 5, well, maybe extending those hours, for when people do start coming back, to allow for kind of a mixed, or to spread out the number of people on things like transit and so on. So time will tell, but definitely having access to different people's opinions and insight, and considering the sources of information, I think it's going to help us predict when that's going to happen.
Well, just to throw in, if you don't mind, there's been talking about market pressures. There's been some interesting market movement here in the Northeast. As far as the ability to retain and obtain armed security. So we're seeing some very interesting things. First of all, armed security has always been a problematic or difficult concept to obtain here in the Northeast for a variety of reasons. But we're seeing that, it's drying up almost overnight, the ability to have an armed security officer at a site for a number of reasons. One, NYPD and the police departments were usually the backstop for that, where you could have an off-duty officer or a special duty officer or whatever what was designated. And now, because of the numbers of officers out sick on their daytime patrol for their municipalities, and the numbers of illnesses, they're mandating 12-hour, 14-hour shifts by the municipalities, and therefore no one has the time or the energy or the ability to work a second job, if you will. And so those numbers are just going down, and you're seeing an increase in the rate of unarmed security officers skyrocket in this area. And so we're seeing crisis pay that is 4 times minimum wage, sometimes 5 times, sometimes 6 times minimum wage at certain locations, which is a boon for those officers that could take those jobs. But at the same time, the security guard companies have to be responsive to moving these pay rates and billing and everything else. So we're just seeing it's all gummed up in the system right now. But I think that after this is all over, there's going to be a real look at how we deal with crises, how we deal with these types of scenarios, because my belief is it's the new normal. We're going to have these types of incidents on a more frequent basis, unfortunately. So the unarmed security officer, that job demographic, there'll be more responsibilities. There'll be better training and more needs and more asks for them going forward. And I think that pay will slowly creep up, which is a benefit. But at the same time, what that does to the total industry will be yet to be determined.
Yeah, that's certainly a big factor moving forward. Is so goes the economy, so goes our industry in certain respects, and things are certainly the new normal right now, and a lot of talk about how long that will last, the pay rates, the increased need, and as you both have pointed out very well, human resources are finite. That there's only enough bodies to go around, so to speak. And we do quite a bit of work with off-duty law enforcement, and those resources are very limited right now. So even if you have that as part of your contingency plan, it's not working out too well when you make those phone calls, because they're stretched thin, and it's really hard to go to plan B when your plan B is somebody else's plan A. So very tough to deal with that. So guys, I can't thank you enough. Excellent thoughts, excellent comments. I picked the right two guys to talk with me today about the coronavirus situation, and doing so under different circumstances here on this platform that we won't name, as Don pointed out. We'll try to use something different in the future. But guys, again, thanks so much for sharing your insight on what's going on in the industry and in your respective locations. Can't thank you enough, and look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully very soon.
Be safe.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thanks.